because I spent my last week out of the country on a very unexpected trip. And the trip was all about the kind of issues that we're hearing now. You know, I was picking up the words from the various presentations, the whole business of the branding and the visibilities of private sector, what is corporate social responsibility, and what does it actually mean to the different players. And I think this is one of those areas where we could have a long debate. Obviously, the issue of competitiveness is a very rife area. And the whole business of regulations and public scrutiny is one area that business has to grapple with on a daily basis. And particularly when this also involves the role of the civil society and the NGOs, who are very important stakeholders as key watchdogs, if you like. And so much as I've been asked to look at the codes of practice in the Kenya flower industry, I would also be looking at some of the issues that are also important in terms of compliance, for what reasons, and what has compliance got for us. How have we gotten to where we have? I think that's also important. What responsibilities have we adopted? Now, the flower industry is one of the key economic activities in this country. It plays between position 1 and position 3 in terms of foreign exchange. Last year, for instance, it brought into the country about 36 billion Kenya shillings. And it's also a very important source of employment, particularly for the what you might call non-skilled. 80% of our workforce is non-skilled, and here we're talking about 90,000 people directly on a payroll. That doesn't include the likes of myself and the likes of people in the transport industry and the packaging industry. I'm talking about people who are directly employed, about 90,000. So it is a key economic activity. It's grown quite fast over the last 10 years. In 2005, we were doing about 25,000 tons of flowers per year. Last year, we did about 120,000 tons per year. I was talking to a gentleman from Ethiopia a few minutes ago, and Ethiopia is one of our very key partners in this business. They're not competitors, they're partners at least at the level of the industry association. Partners in that, much as Kenya has a market share of 35%, we couldn't maintain that market share without the contribution from the other Eastern African countries for the African flower. So it's important that we work together. It's important that the emerging countries learn from ourselves so that they don't make the same mistakes. Particularly in a situation whereby you see in other parts of the world the industry sort of aging out, if you like. For instance, in Japan, it's aging out. In Colombia, land is getting so expensive, so there's much more investment in real property. And in Europe, it's become too expensive. So basically, we're talking about an industry that is likely to expand quite substantially in this part of the world. And therefore, the elements that you bring up, the elements of environmental stewardship, the elements of social accountability are very important for an industry such as this one. Now, the Kenya Flower Council, their business is, this was started in 1996. And this was on the premise that market access was going to continue to be the key thing in terms of sustaining the industry. And so a couple of growers got together and they decided that they really needed to look at what was important for them to be able to continue doing business. And so the key objectives here were to ensure that the standards were at the highest level in terms of good agriculture practice, minimize the impact of farming practice on the environment, and conserve. And these were the things that were of a great concern to the marketplace, if you like. And in the absence of a government policy on horticulture, which today is still in the draft form, we still don't have one, they began to develop their own policy, if you like, and formulated this into a code of practice. Now, it was not an invention of any sort. It basically took about 23 different government statutes, took the dictates of the ILO or the recommendations or principles of the ILO, the International Code of Conducts, the ethical trade initiatives, and compounded this into a document which has been a growing document. And this document really looked at what are the core values for the growers. What was it that they wanted to ensure that, that they were identified with in terms of their production, responsibility, safe working environments, business carried out according to the laws of Kenya. This is one of the most codified industries in the world. And I can assure you that a lot of the farms will be going through more than 10 audits in a year. But a lot of these are international standards, and international standards by their very nature are quite generic, and you do need to be able to precipitate these international requirements, if you like, into the local situation, and that is why it's so important for us to ensure that we embed the laws of Kenya in this code of practice. A lot of people know the flower industry as Naivasha. And true to word, Naivasha does produce 70% of the flowers that come out of Kenya, but we have many other growing areas in the country, emerging areas in the Mount Kenya area, Athi River, and up in out in Eldoret. And increasingly, Naivasha will cease to be the main focus. Now, you will also be very aware of the issues that have been around Lake Naivasha. In fact, that is exactly why I had to rush into Britain last week, because we have a project called Imarisha Naivasha. For those of you who haven't done your Kiswahili lessons, Imarisha Naivasha means restoring the Lake Naivasha. And this is a project that our own Prime Minister and the Prince of Wales have decided that they want to champion. And the two gentlemen wanted to get a brief from the industry in terms of what we are doing about Imarisha Naivasha over dinner. That was quite pleasant. And so the thing here is to say that we, as an industry, we are very aware of the responsibility that is placed upon ourselves in terms of spearheading any initiatives that are looking at the key issues that you were talking about this afternoon, the key issues of water, the key issues of land and energy, and of course the social factor. And so when we talk about restoration of Naivasha, bearing in mind that we are not the only operators in Naivasha, bearing in mind that we are not the major water abstractors in that area, but we're the most visible. And therefore, we have to take that responsibility as an industry, and that we have. Just to show you, I mentioned that Lake Naivasha is not the only area that grows flowers. If you see the blue balloons there, these are the other key areas. And this is just to give you the working model of the Kenya Flower Council. The heart of the council, as I mentioned, which was formed in 1996, started off with 5 members. To date, we have about 68 members. And these control between 50 to 60% of all the volumes exported out of the country. If one flower farm in Naivasha was to join the Kenya Flower Council today, we would hit the 80% of all the volumes exported out of Kenya. Now, why would anyone not join Kenya Flower Council? Because if you don't subscribe to the Kenya Flower Council Code of Practice, then you cannot be a member of Kenya Flower Council, regardless of how big you are or how important you seemingly are. You have to subscribe to that code. It is the weaving thread, if you like, of the membership. And with that recognition in mind, what the association has done is that it has developed that code to the extent that today the Kenya Flower Council is a certified body, an accredited certification body, ISO Guide 65. And this means that we run a scheme, a grower scheme, that is backed by a solid quality management system, which is subjected to scrutiny every year by South African National Accreditation Services, just to make sure that we're doing our business professionally. In addition to that, I did mention that we are one of the most codified sectors, and so we have also gone out to benchmark and to seek mutual recognition with other codes. And that's why we talk about the KS 1758, which is the Kenya standard for flowers and ornamentals, Global GAP, which used to be Europe GAP, the Tesco Trade scheme, and many others like we're currently working with the fair trade, so that eventually our goal is to have one strong growers code that meets almost any market requirements. Obviously, that is going to be a tall order, but we believe we can find mechanisms of working with different schemes from different markets with different requirements. To back that up, we have a certification committee, and this is probably of interest to a lot of you. That certification committee is very independent to the extent that it has only 2 board members. The other 8, because it's a committee of 10, the other 8 come in from appointed by the PES Agriculture, PES Labor, Director Kenya Bureau of Standards, Director NEMA. So we have government actually sitting in that certification committee in the line areas of regulations that determine or govern the industry. We also have a representative appointed by the Secretary General Kotu to look after the trade issues. We have a representative of the marketplace, the biggest, now single biggest auction in Europe, Flora Holland, and we have a peer body, the Bureau Veritas, sitting in there, and we have an NGO as well. And every quarter, they will sit and look at all the audits done by the Secretariat, and they will check them for process, and if they're happy, they will get certified either gold or silver. If they're not happy, they can interrogate further until they're completely happy that only deserving members get certificated. And here we are saying that because of the pressure that the industry has been put under to perform in terms of social accountability, in terms of environmental stewardship, we've had to develop a transparent system that is also administered with integrity, if you like, so that all the stakeholders, all the regulating bodies that are interested in the sector have a chance to see what the industry looks like. At least 50 to 60% of the volumes are grown in this country. Technical committee to assist with the technical issues, as you can imagine. And then we have the pink balloon over there. This is where we have all the associate members. And these are people who want to associate themselves with the industry, either in terms of service providers or product providers, government itself, and development agencies. Over the years, we've received very little attention from development agencies. And the reason was that the industry was seen to be well-heeled. But that has changed, because I think there's been recognition that it's not just an industry, it's not just a business, but it's also a leader in terms of development. If you look at the numbers we are talking about, if you look at the kind of capacities we have developed, if you go to farms in Ethiopia, if you go to farms in Tanzania, Uganda, they'll be mainly managed by Kenyan managers, even down as far as South Africa. If you look at our own government institutions that have grown in response to the consumer demands or the market demands, KEFIS is now an international center of excellence in terms of phytosanitary certification. And so with that sort of a spin-off, if you like, the donor agencies are beginning to pay attention to this sector, and I'm happy to say that we're receiving quite a bit of attention. When you drive around the country also, and I do hope you get time to do that, you will see a lot of little greenhouses. You will see a lot of water pans. And these are people who have been looking at what is happening in the export horticulture and how can they also use that to produce their own food. So that is also another spin-off. Surprisingly, we only export 7% of our horticulture flowers plus fruits and vegetables, and 95% is utilized locally and regionally, and we still have the challenges of famine. And yet, we are one of the best performers in terms of exports. That is the paradox of the sector in Kenya. I did talk about what the Code of Practice is all about, and I wouldn't want to go through that again. I did mention that the scheme has 2 levels. We have the silver and the gold. And the difference between the two, and this, by the way, you will find gold certificated flower farms that are very small scale. It is not a question of the size, it's a question of the quality management systems that you adopt on your farm, how formal they are, how clear they are, and what kind of, for instance, in your waste management, what kind of systems have you adopted. So we certificate between silver and gold, And some of the farms will either be non-certified because they've fallen out of certification, or they'll be working on the certification for one reason or the other. And we do eject membership, people from farms from the membership if they don't comply. Now, the other thing that we have to be very keen about is to stay abreast with industry dynamics in order to stay relevant at the Kenya Flower Council. For instance, we had a lot of talk about the CDM, the climate change interventions and the CDM projects. Those would be some of the issues we are considering as we look at Imarisha Naivasha. At the moment, we're doing some regional teleconferences where we are looking at the impact of climate change on floriculture and looking at possible interventions. So we have to stay abreast with what is happening here and to make sure that we are right at the forefront of water issues. For instance, the carbon footprints and the water footprints. We have to be right at the forefront of that. We talked about what the practice is in the code. We talked about the good agriculture practice. Of course, crop protection strategy, particularly again in response to the climate change and in response to a safe use of pesticides. Increasingly now you will see that we're going more green, we're using more biocontrols and less of the very toxic chemicals. We use the WHO classified chemicals, and of course we have our own internal government regulations as to what can and cannot be used. And I did mention that the worker safety is key in terms of the kind of protective clothing we provide or the kind of facilities we provide on these farms, some of the very key elements of that code of practice. What are our challenges? We talked about perception, we talked about feasibility, and I can tell you, I've been on these farms now for 5 years, and I know they're doing a good job, but no one wants to hear a good story. If you get to the newspapers and give them a good story, chances are that it will not appear in the following day's reporting. And these are some of the challenges that we have to deal with. And however, I must say that here in Kenya, at least with the local press, with the regional press, this has changed a whole lot because of the kind of interaction that we have had and the exposure, if you like. Whereas at the international market, we're still having challenges, which is where it is important. And these are some of the issues that we were discussing last week with the retailers to see how we can deal with this, what somebody referred to as a shared risk in terms of perception. It's a shared risk in terms of perception. It's not just about Kenya, it's about the retailers in Europe. It's about anybody who's doing any business in the horticulture industry. We have issues with, like everybody else, with taxes and levies. And just to give you an example, we were talking about incentives at 1.2. Under the Ministry of Trade, we are considered farmers. So we do not get the incentives that the manufacturing sector gets because we are farmers. Under the same Ministry of Trade, we are considered manufacturers. So we pay the Kenya Bureau of Standards levy like all the other manufacturers. This is in the same ministry, and you cannot wriggle out of it. So currently what we're doing is trying to find an incentive scheme for the industry that allows us to incentivize those of us who are investing in good practices, those of us who are investing in water technologies that allow us to use water efficiently, or that allow us to harvest water, or to rehabilitate the water catchment areas, because like you rightly said, you do need incentives to be able to separate the chaff from the wheat itself. I talked about the compliance and audits, and very often you find that government doesn't really want to listen to issues that mean they reduce what they consider as their revenue. And you get a lot of times you'll find a very blank face. But it is important to realize that if you are not talking about growth, if you're not talking about expansion, if you're not talking about penetrating your markets any deeper, if you're not talking about creating employment, then you really have no business talking about an industry that you don't want to support as a government. And so what we are currently working on is a competitiveness study that will show explicitly where the Kenya competitiveness stands in terms of the global positioning. And I do believe that once such a paper is produced, we shall be able to discuss more coherently with the government and other stakeholders. Need I talk about natural calamities that are not anticipated whatsoever? For instance, the Icelandic volcanic eruption. You're aware of the kind of change of weather patterns that we've had, droughts here in Kenya, extreme colds in the marketplace, and we are also victims of political strife. For instance, what happened here in 2007, 2008. But you'll also be surprised to know that during that Valentine, in the midst of that chaos in this country, this industry set a record of the amount of flowers that we sent into the marketplace. We have not been able to surpass that record in times of peace, before and after. How that happened, I still wonder. In terms of which way are we taking the industry, somebody talked about efficient use of resources. We're looking at productivity, we're looking at cleaner production methodologies, right throughout the whole of the supply chain, of the value chain, to see where are we eroding our profits, where can we close these taps, so that that question of price, that question of fair returns, we can begin to balance some of those issues, particularly in an industry that seems to be very unpredictable in terms of at the global level. You look at the financial situation or the economic situation globally, and you look at how the repercussions affect countries like ourselves when things go wrong in Spain, when things go funny in Greeceland and elsewhere. The foreign exchange, the rolling forex exchange rates really do affect our business, because you cannot plan the cost of energy, not just the cost of energy, but the availability of energy, the reliability of energy, and that makes life extremely difficult. We would like to enhance our collaboration with government more, because this is one area where we know we must invest in these environmental stewardship areas, social welfare areas, and we need the goodwill of the government to help us with that. Obviously, we don't want any more regulations, but would like to have it to become more effective in what we do. And one of the things that we're working on is I talked about that the Kenya Flower Council represents between 50 to 60% of the volumes exported out of the country. The strategy now is to ensure that we actually have a national compliance system that makes sure that everybody who exports out of this country also complies with a certain minimum set of standards. And with that lovely pink rose, thank you very much.